Our podcast partner for this session is Launcho.
We are delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present our last session of the festival. The virtual world has become more real than the physical. Payal Arora, Marcus de Sautoy, Tarun This session is in partnership with the United Nations India. Has technology, with its augmented and extended reality and the social disengagement of the pandemic, transformed our perception of the real? Has the virtual world changed and upended the significance of physical experience? What are the definitions of reality? What defines the new realities? Writers, thinkers, futurists, and traditionalists discuss and debate if the virtual has overtaken the real. Payal Arora is a digital anthropologist, a TEDx speaker, and an award-winning author of several books, including The Next Billion Users with Harvard Press. Her expertise lies in ethical AI, inclusive design, and global digital cultures. Marcus de Sautoy is the Simonyi Professor of the Public Understanding of Science and Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's the author of 6 books and a play, I is a Strange Loop, in which he was also the lead actor. Tarun Khanna is the George Paulo Leman Professor at Harvard, where he has taught at HBS and at Harvard College for 25 years, focusing on the role of entrepreneurs in developing countries. His latest book, Trust, and his earlier, Billions of Entrepreneurs, chronicle creative ventures in China, India, and beyond. He also co-authored Winning in Emerging Markets, a framework for building world-class enterprises in emerging markets. Renata Lok-Dessallien is the United Nations Resident Coordinator in India. Ms. Renata Dessallien has served the United Nations for 35 years in Africa and Asia in many capacities, including 15 years as a UN Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator, and UNDP Resident Representative. Before taking up her assignment as UN Resident Coordinator in India, she was a Senior Fellow at the Oslo Governance Center at UNDP in Norway. Prior to that, she was UN Resident and UNDP Resident Representative in Bhutan, Bangladesh, China, and Myanmar between 2002 and 2017. She also served in various capacities with the UN in Mali, Laos, and in New York, making important contributions in the field of good governance and poverty reduction. Pragya Sharma has worked with Unilever for 16 years on diverse sales, marketing, and business roles in India and MENA region, across the categories of beauty and personal care, coffee, and tea. She joined Amazon India in October 2020 as the Director for Media category, which includes books, video games, software, toys, and personal care appliances. Meredith Broussard is an Associate Professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of New York University and the author of Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence in investigative reporting, with a particular interest in using data analysis for social good. Sanjoy K. Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the Managing Director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launched during lockdown digital JLF Brave New World series. He is a founder trustee of Salam Balak Trust, providing support services for street and working children in Delhi. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, the virtual world has become more real than the physical. Payal Arora, Marcus de Sautoy, Tarun Khanna, Renata Lok-Dessallien, Pragya Sharma, and Meredith Broussard, moderated by Sanjoy Roy. Over to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ankur, and welcome to all our wonderful guests from across the world. The very fact that we are here and connected to places from Jaipur and Delhi to Cambridge in America to London, and we're here virtually, sort of says something about this particular version of the Jaipur Literature Festival, which many of you have been to and many of you have loved to attend in person. I'm going to just start by, when we put this out, we wanted it to be a debate with a for and against, and then everybody wrote in saying that they were on a particular side and nobody wanted to be against the motion. So we've converted it and sort of said, okay, I'm going to go around, get each of you to make an opening statement about your point of view, and then we will try and see how we can unpack some of the ideas that we're looking at over the next hour. In no particular order, let me start with Renata and ask her to open today's session with her comments. Renata, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. Great pleasure to be with you. And even though you've done a lot to make this virtual version of the festival come alive, I still wish that we were all meeting in Jaipur. But that being said, I think that the topic that you've raised opens some very big confluences of factors. And at some of those confluences, the output or the outcome is very positive and very exciting. And at other confluences, it's extremely negative. And I'm going to be a little bit of a wet blanket because I have great concerns about some of the negative. I'm a big fan of digital technology. I think that, with regards to meeting the SDGs and creating a fairer and more sustainable and a more equitable world, that the contributions of the digital sphere is going to be extraordinary. But I also feel that at some of these confluences, we have something extremely negative happens. It relates very much to the fact that we're getting lost in a virtual world. And I think we're actually at the cusp or at the beginning of a social emergency that is arising from these confluences, and that it's not so far from the climate change emergency in terms of proportions. If we just take at the individual level, in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen two very big shifts. One of these shifts has to do with the amount of time that we're actually spending on time online, the sheer time spent. We have studies that are already several years old that show that, at least in the US, the number of times that people will either tap or swipe or click or scroll on their digital devices is upwards of 2,000 times. And I am absolutely sure that COVID has only increased that. And at the upper range, it's something like 5,000 times. We have other studies that show that on average, people spend 6.42 minutes, 6 hours, 42 minutes each day online. That's enormous. That's basically 40% of our waking hours, 100 days per year. And the opportunities cost of that in terms of spending time with your loved ones, with your family, with colleagues, or other things is enormous. The second big change is that we've moved into an era of serious machine learning using AI and big data. And again, there are some fantastic positives. I don't think we would have got the COVID vaccine in less than 12 months had we not had the assistance of AI. But particularly when combined with social media, we have a phenomena that's called the commodification of our attention, basically the attention economy, which means that behind the scenes, without our consent, without our knowledge or even ability to influence, we're being profiled. We are having material customized individually, not even to groups, but individually. We're being slotted into psychological types, political profiles, personality traits, and interests. And we're getting to a point where machines are knowing more about us than we actually know about ourselves. In the US, on average, there's some 5,000 data points held for each individual. So this is leading to behavioral changes, behavioral shifts in what we do and what we think. We're not even aware of it sometimes, we're conscious of it. We are eroding our independence, our sovereign agency. Some people are calling it brain hacking. And as I said, this is happening in a black box without our being able to know it. So this is having severe consequences in terms of brain health. Studies are showing, heightened attention deficits, emotional and social intelligence erosion. It's leading to addiction to technology, social isolation. In some cases, it's even interfering with brain development, not to mention the impact that it has on sleep. On depression, anxiety, and at the very extreme of that, even self-harm. We've seen an incredible rise across the US, UK, and Canada. And these are very, very serious impacts on how we see ourselves, how we see society, and how we see the world. I won't even get into the issue of violence, virtual game violence, and the impact.
Let's hold on the violence and come back to it. I love what you said about brain hacking and, of course, the depression and self-harm. Let me go to Tarun Khanna, sitting in Cambridge, Boston. Tarun, over to you.
Thanks, Sanjoy. Lovely to be with so many friends and old and new. Thank you again to your team for an amazing experience. I thought I'd contribute 2 recent experiences because there's nothing like immediacy to address the issue of to what extent has the virtual become the real. The first is a short course that I just had the privilege of teaching with a couple of colleagues at Harvard and MIT, intended for would-be entrepreneurs in Africa, in the innermost reaches of Africa, right? Which of course would never have happened if it wasn't for COVID, because we invented this online and ran with it. And on the one hand, it was a very positive experience. People appreciated it. They got something out of it. There's even some real action on the ground that's been triggered by it in about 34 of Africa's 54 countries. So that's lovely. On the other hand, I was just reflecting that the actual course was only 6 weeks long, but it took us 6 to 9 months to get it off the ground. And the reason was entirely the extent to which the real is impinging on the virtual and is not letting the virtual really get into the swing of things. What I mean by that are, the regulations on the ground are so extremely different across the 54 African countries. The payment systems are still anachronistic. Someone like me who is primarily immersed in the US, India, and China, I guess I got seduced into thinking that we're now in a completely new technology-enabled era. But it occurs to me, and maybe somebody like Renata can comment with her experiences in so many different developing countries, that for maybe 6.5 of the 8 billion people in the world, I don't think the virtual is real at all. And that it just was brought home to me how difficult it was to get this off the ground. So we can sit here in our rarefied worlds of overly educated, for want of a less impolite term. And for us, maybe the virtual is starting to become real, but I'm not so sure. The second quick thing, Sanjoy, is more an academic study I'm involved with one of my favorite organizations, which is BRAC. BRAC is a world's biggest NGO in Bangladesh, started by Sir Fazle Abed Bhai, really a mentor to me and just an iconic figure, sadly just passed away. But BRAC is active doing development work, in, I don't know, a dozen countries or so, primarily Bangladesh. But what this study is showing us is that when asked, this is sort of more of a econometric study, a statistical study. What it shows us is that when asked to decide what extent does it make sense to mix the virtual and the real, what we're finding is that some level of interim virtualness is what's preferred both by the workforce. So these are workers who are both in semi-corporate settings in Dhaka, but also people who are out in the field doing development work. And so then, pardon my mind jumping around, I was reminded of a lovely essay by Robert Merton, a famous sociologist, going back to, I want to say 1935, 36, where he talks about a rush to judgment, right? So he talks about purposive social action, but rushing to judgment about it. And I'm wondering whether we're rushing to judgment, because the BRAC study seems to suggest that all virtual is not going to be real, that some mix of virtualness and realness is the way to go. So I'll stop with that, Sanjoy, hand back to you. But two vignettes that put some boundary conditions around the question on the table.
Thank you, Tarun. Can I ask Pragya? Pragya, you're on mute. You need to, yeah.
Thanks, Sanjoy. Firstly, it's an honor and a privilege to be here and be speaking with all of you esteemed panelists. So thank you for having me. I think let me just start this by two insights, and by definition, insights are universal human truths. So I think the first insight, maybe a bit cliched, but well known, is necessity is the mother of invention. And I'll elaborate that in a bit. And the second one is we as humans don't value certain freedoms and privileges available to us till such time that they are taken away from us. Let me just talk about these two and come to the topic. I think on the first one, on necessity is the mother of invention, it's a well-known, I mean, history is testimony that disasters and disruptions that we have faced as well during this pandemic are a huge setback to mankind, but they also challenge our grit and fuel us to bounce back and give us the energy to propel forward in the future, motivation to innovate and invent. And I think never before in the last decade have we used technology the way we have used in the last 1 year. And I think this was probably one of the core uses why technology, the internet, the social connectivity, this was really the true purpose of the technology that we have used in our times today. Let me just quote, bear with me, I take you to the commerce side of things, but life has to go on and businesses have to go on. And I must say that COVID-19 has had a major impact on the world around us and created several challenges for especially the small and medium businesses, which are really the growth engine of the Indian economy specifically. And these smaller companies have still continued to grow because they were the ones who actually adopted technology, shed the mindsets. And it has been quite humbling how they have adopted the platform, be it Amazon or any other platform. The recent pandemic has divided our time in pre and post-COVID, and our biggest takeaway has been that 2020 has seen how customers and businesses are increasingly relying on technology and the world around us. We've had customers demand everything from potting soil to refrigerators and closer homes. Since we are in this forum, the demand for regional books, especially in the languages of Hindi, Malayalam and Marathi, has doubled since the last 2 to 3 years. An interesting trend. I mean, what can be more pleasurable than children taking to reading? And we've actually seen the demand for children books, go 1.3 times. Very interestingly, books are back into gifting. We saw book sets like those of the Harry Potter series, the J.R.R. Tolkien, even Tintin comics being bought and gifted to people because they didn't have access to reach their loved ones. These may not be innovations or inventions as we know it, but this has definitely been an innovation in human behavior, in our consumer mindset, to break certain barriers, to take to new forms, to hustle, and to figure out ways of reaching out. I go to the second point with this, and that is on the privileges that we have. We've always had this notion that we can travel and be with anybody who we want to be, whether it's at work, an old close friend, or extended family. It just required booking a ticket and getting onto a plane. See what happened in the last 1 year. We couldn't do that. We couldn't even reach out to our neighbors. That notion of physical proximity was taken away, and then we were like fish without water. And I think it was in these times that we've seen social connectedness, social dependencies, and teamwork at workplace come to the best with the use of technology. I would actually dare say that it has been an age of physical disengagement, physical distancing, but social connectedness and social proximity. I mean, when was the last time we just picked the phone or booked a Zoom call to our friend sitting in the US who we had not spoken to for ages and just said, hey, how are you doing? Are you staying safe? Our engagements never went beyond extended, beyond our close family. I mean, here we have families doing game nights, playing app-based games, and having some good quality time together like they would have never had before in the last decade for sure. So I think, yes, there are pros and cons. I am inclined to look at the pros because it is this time that really challenges us to use technology to its best use, like I said, probably for which it was invented. I'd stop here, Sanjoy.
Thanks, Pragya. Taken that on board, especially the travel, and of course what's interesting. I mean, the question that I'll come back to you while you're saying that books are being gifted. Of course, we know that parents are trying to make an effort to be with their children and do something substantial, and it's a whole new parenting world. But we'll come back to that in a second. Meredith, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. It is such an honor to be here at the Jaipur Literature Festival. I want to talk about the difference between online and offline. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has brought into stark relief is the fact that online is the same as offline. Online and IRL are the same. They've always been the same. And what the pandemic has done is it has kind of forced the issue. And it's made a lot of people who considered online and offline to be different to realize that the two are the same. So people are discovering that the virtual world and the real world are the same, and it's great. One of the things that I've found personally about the pandemic and using technology is that I am video conferencing or video chatting with a lot of people who I didn't before. I was always a video chat user, but things like family game night, we never had family game night digitally before. We would just have family parties in my family and we would spend time together that way. And so the virtual game night has been a nice substitute when we haven't been able to be together. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind, though, is the idea that online or offline would be better, right? That one is better than the other. And the idea that the virtual world would be better than the real world is part of an idea that I call techno-chauvinism. It's a kind of bias that says that technology is superior. Techno-chauvinist bias comes out when we say things like, oh, we should use AI to make a decision instead of using people to make a decision because the AI is going to be better, more objective, or more unbiased. And instead, what I would argue is that we need to think about what is the right tool for the task. Sometimes the right tool for a task is a computer, absolutely. And sometimes the right tool for the task is something simple like a book in the hands of a child sitting on its parent's lap. One is not better or superior to the other. It's about the right tool for the task. The virtual world has been a lifesaver during the pandemic. I think something that's important, though, is that it's not a complete substitute. So we can't imagine that we're going toward a world where all of us are only going to have virtual relationships, where we're all going to stay in our homes all the time and get our groceries delivered and do our financial transactions exclusively online and have things delivered in, kind of Ready Player One world. It's just not reasonable. I don't know about you, but I am tired of being in the house. I am tired of not being around people. Humans are social creatures. We need to be around other people to sustain us emotionally, to sustain us physically as well. I was a little terrified by what Renata said about brain hacking, about attention deficits, about the rise of violence. And I hope we can get back to that a little bit. The thing that I would add to her discussion of what's going on in AI is I would add the complications of ethics and also of climate change. So let's talk about climate change first. When we use technology, we tend to imagine that it is just happening with us. So like when you pick up your phone and you do something on your phone, you imagine that, okay, well, it's just limited to my phone and limited to the power that I'm using on my phone. It's not at all. Every app nowadays uses enormous amounts of cloud computing power, AI especially, which is embedded in all of our, well, not all. AI is embedded in so many of the things that we do. AI is a mathematical process that happens on computers. It's not the Hollywood image of AI. It's really beautiful, gorgeous, innovative math. And that math happens on computers. The computers take up cycles, and AI is an enormous contributor to climate change. Training an AI model in order to, say, help refine Google search a little bit more, has an enormous environmental impact. It uses an enormous amount of power. So we have to think about this. What are the trade-offs? And we have to stop imagining that tech is somehow more environmentally responsible than other ways of generating knowledge or other ways of leading our lives. And then the last thing I would say is we should consider making more ethical technology. Technology is a blunt instrument. And there are all kinds of inequalities embedded in the technologies that we use. So for example, the cameras that we use for video conferencing have facial recognition built in so they can focus. Well, one of the problems with computer imaging is that it is racist. It doesn't recognize people with darker skin. We see this in the exam proctoring systems that claim that they can do remote proctoring of exams. Well, people with darker skin don't get recognized by the exam proctoring system or get flagged more for cheating, right? So the technologies that we use have systems of privilege built in, hierarchies of privilege built in. And what they're doing is they're duplicating the world as it is right now. What I would argue instead is that we should move toward developing technologies that get us toward a better world. We should develop technologies that lead us to a more ethical, more just, more equitable world, as opposed to just replicating the world as we have it right now. So again, the technologies that we've used during the pandemic have been a lifesaver, but let's not stop there. Let's not stop and say, okay, it works really well now. We'll just keep doing this from now on. Let's make it better.
Thought about more empathetic and how technology can be used. You talked about technology in the visual effect of Hollywood. Let me ask Marcus at this point of time to actually come in on his point of view. Marcus.
Well, great to join you. And one of the advantages of this new world is that you can put yourself in a quantum superposition and do two things at the same time. So I'm afraid I've been watching the Arsenal play Leicester and beat them 3-1 whilst listening to you all. So a few advantages of being in a virtual world. But I'm actually going to take a very different perspective on all of this, because when I get a statement like the virtual has become more real than the physical, what I want to do is take a really deep time perspective on this. Our current situation is a blip in everything that is happening in our universe, and an interesting blip. But I think that for me, the question that was raised in the introduction about what really is real, and it's interesting, the physical for me is actually very transitory. A deep time perspective from physics indicates that our future is actually rather bleak, because particles will decay. Protons take a very long time to decay, but they will decay. Black holes, they leak and eventually will just go pop and disappear. Our future is actually one where the universe is incredibly boring and is just basically reduced to photons and gravitons. And so there will not be any physical other than this form of energy. And if one looks back in deep time to the beginning, where did all of this come from? Well, you know, there was a moment when there was nothing and then there was something. So this is a very transitory period that we're in. For me, if you're looking for the things that are real, you've got to look for the things which are outside of time. For me, the things which are outside of time are mathematics. We've already had a wonderful celebration by Meredith of mathematics. But for me, the one thing that actually does not require creation, does not require physicality, is in some sense the perfect example of the virtual, because it doesn't need the physical, are mathematical ideas. And so for me, I feel that what we're living in is a physicalized piece of mathematics. We see again, time and again, the physics being reduced to extraordinary mathematical equations. So for me, the numbers that I'm wearing now, they are the reality. They are what builds us. And if we're actually coming back to our very specific time now and celebrating the virtual, what is the virtual? It is just a load of numbers, of zeros and ones. At the moment, you're all experiencing us thanks to us being converted into numbers and information, which is a kind of new form of energy. So I would say the physical is certainly not the most interesting thing. For me, the fact that we can have a virtual world is the fact that we are all translated into number, and number is the only thing which is real.
Numbers are the only thing that's real. It's absolutely fascinating point of view. Payal, over to you.
Sure. So, all right, true, as an anthropologist, I'll agree with the statement and then completely dismiss it as an irrelevant statement and propose something else. So, all right, when we talk about the virtual becoming more real than the physical, what we're doing is we're trying to relate the two together, when actually, when I'm agreeing that the virtual in relation to its former self versus the physical in relation to its former self of reality has changed. And our physicality has actually reduced in terms of its affect, its meaning making, because much, as actually what Pragya and others have said, has been stripped of its meaning, right? Whereas the virtual has enhanced because it had to. So we are actually forcing the two in relation with each other. As Meredith says, they are completely intertwined, right? And it is meaningless, thereby a framing and question. So what is really essential really is to ask ourselves, what does it mean in terms of reality? And in that sense, it's very deeply rooted into terms of, firstly, it cannot be answered in universal terms. You can't just talk in universal terms. It's obviously contextual. It's geopolitical, meaning that what's happening in Amsterdam here with complete lockdowns and the physical and virtual realities of the wealthier countries are very different from that in Nigeria or elsewhere, right? And whether it's economic with the frontline workers from the gig economy, I'm pretty sure someone who's delivering my pizza has a very different take from my perspective and my experiences. And, you know, and then you have the social cultural, where we've seen evidence where high rates of domestic violence and enormous amounts of care work has fallen on the shoulders of women over that of men. So these realities, we cannot speak in universal terms about the virtual and the real when we aren't talking about specific populations and groups. And it comes down to, what do we mean by real is being alive is survival, right? And then you can say, okay, obviously let's talk in physical terms, because if someone shoots me down today, well, it doesn't matter how active my avatar is that Facebook continues to generate, I'm dead, right? For all purposes. Or feeling alive, right? Being alive versus feeling alive. And what makes you feel alive is a sort of like a ABC of life, which is authenticity, right? Are the forums and sites where I can self-actualize expand, and indeed in that sense the virtual can expand it, right? And in for good and for better, right? And for good, better, and worse. I could become like a hacker too, in terms of the bonding, where what kinds of interpersonal relationships can I create? And I can create really devastating relationships where I come together with other members and sort of hack together. So it doesn't have to be all celebratory either. And then the C part is the community and the connectivity, where yes, new forms of solidarities have come up, but new forms of sort of cyber armies too. So we can't speak in optimistic or pessimistic terms. We have to actually it's a leap of faith that I believe it's going to be a positive end, because I can't afford to be a pessimist. And thereby, it's not the evidence-based approach, it is a belief-based approach. And thereby, I approach this sort of area in that regard. And I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Payal. You know, what has been fascinating is that while the virtual world has always existed, certainly for the last 2 decades, the pandemic has really forced us to acknowledge it and make it part of our daily life. Earlier, it wasn't. I mean, it was because we were always on our phones and our laptops and our computing, but in many ways, it wasn't. It hadn't impacted us all personally. But Renata, I'm going to start with you and I'm going to ask you, what does this do to the whole notion of country and nationalism? Today, when the virtual world allows you to be anywhere and everywhere, and when you're looking at not any more of place or identity, does it threaten, in many words, the very notion of nationhood? When the lockdown happened, many of our countries, certainly in India, and I know many places across the world, every condominium sort of ceded from their neighborhood, every gated community shut themselves down. The smallest villages in faraway Bihar sort of barricaded themselves and said, we don't want anybody to come in or to come out. So every place became a republic. What does this do to the concept of nationhood? And look into time. I mean, in many ways, what Marcus said, what we are in is a transitory period. Capitol Hill, what's been happening there, or what's happened across the world, all of these are just many ways symptomatic of what could be. So I'd love to hear your point of view there.
Thanks, Sanjoy. Great question. And I think opposite things are happening simultaneously. You referred to the fact that, you know, gated communities became their own republic. In a sense, we were going into a kind of microcosm, right? Well, basically of isolation. At the same time, people were connecting like mad in the virtual world. So I think your question related to that. So what's it doing in terms of connecting us, and what is the impact of that on sovereign states? I think clearly the virtual connectivity is like an extension of globalization. It's a threat to the nation state in some way. Not everything, but it could be seen as a threat to the nation state. And an element of that, which I think is important to bring out, is where is all this sitting on? And it's sitting on basically, you know, a very limited number of companies who now have reach across the world, almost across the entire world, and who are basically also making money and interesting profits off this connectivity. And there was a parallel that came to mind as you were speaking, with respect to the fact that, you know, the Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Alphabet, you know, the company that owns Google, basically collectively make up a $4 trillion US, which is like more than most countries. It's more than the Indian economy. So, I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary, and it actually evokes back into my mind, you know, images of, and maybe this is a bit too negative, but, you know, images of the British East Indian Company, which at one point in time actually had an army that was bigger than any other country's army in the world. And this was owned by, an army owned by a company. So it makes me think, you know, where are we in terms of the evolution of the nation state? I think I think this incredible move towards a greater virtual world, our engagement with the virtual world, will unite us in many ways, but it will certainly threaten a whole range of assumptions and structures. It's not only just a question of nation states, it's also a question, what is it doing to our democracies? On the one hand, it's helping to spread an incredible amount of information. People who do have access, and I'm terribly conscious of the fact of the people who do not have access yet. It's a big part of the UN to try to help countries ensure that everyone has access. But for those who do have access, can be better educated than ever before in the history and could be more responsible citizens. And at the same time, the opposite is true, because the way that these algorithms are being triggered to non-transparently affect our behavior behind our back, so to speak, actually takes away our agency. And it's creating, because of the fake news and disinformation that's out there, because of the filter bubbles that put us into little groups, and we're fed information that the algorithm thinks will make us feel comfortable and happy, basically it's eroding the common ground that we used to share. And it's also making
that I'm conscious that we're going to run out of time very quickly. Let me go
Sure.
quickly to Pragya, based on what you've said. Pragya, are the social media platforms the new virtual world? Is it a new virtual community? Is that the new virtual republic, given that it has money, power, connectivity, people of a certain kind coming together? It's already a community. It makes more money than many countries. Is this the future of the world?
Sanjoy, I think yes and no. They are social platforms, right? And they cannot exist till the society around is present on them. By the very definition of it being a social platform, there are consumers who are participating and they are on these platforms. It is a facility made available, but people have chosen to be there, right? It is serving a consumer demand. I don't know whether it is a republic in itself or it is becoming a cohort. Let me just quote the examples of things that we are doing right now. It is extremely humbling how India has responded, and I'll stick to India because that's where I have the most facts. Millions of Indians have made us a part of their daily lives. Let me take the example of Amazon. We were not offering a lot of the assortment that we offer today before the COVID times. Some essentials, some non-essentials, which have come into demand, have been made available so that the life moves on. Now, this is just one example. It has also created livelihoods for a lot of small and medium businesses. 10 lakh small and medium businesses have onboarded in the last 1 year. Now, it is again just offering a facility based on how consumers and sellers or any other cohorts of people want to move on in their lives. And this facility is available. Yeah. Whether it is becoming a kind of a social republic, there is a lot of responsibility on people who run these platforms, and I think that is very well known. And like Meredith also said, whereby she spoke in context of AI and responsible technology, and I think there is a lot more responsibility with which we need to run and manage some of these platforms, because they are probably, Marcus has mentioned, Payal has mentioned, it's the context in which we look at these. They will provide convenience, they will provide a certain value, emotional, monetary, whatever you want to call it, and they will provide a certain variety, which the consumers want.
Pragya, hold that. Meredith, do social media platforms take their responsibility seriously? When President Trump was knocked off without necessarily a sort of due process, it was a huge furor on all sides. Today, each of these platforms command enormous power. Google auntie knows all. What is the responsibility, therefore, of these platforms to these communities who get hooked and live half their lives on it?
I think that social media platforms have an enormous responsibility. And I think that they do not take that responsibility seriously enough. I think that social media platforms have not done enough to combat misinformation. They have not done enough to combat the fake news crisis. They have not done enough to combat anti-vaccine rhetoric. They have profited enormously from the proliferation of misinformation, and they have done this without shame and without acknowledging the extent of the responsibility that they bear toward all of us. So I think that kicking off Donald Trump was a step in the right direction. I think that he used the platform to foment insurrection. I think that that is not what anybody wants. And so I think it was an appropriate decision in this case. I think that the social media platforms have just been shirking their responsibility for years. And it's time to step up. It's time to be adults and say, no, you can't just open the gates of the playground and let everybody in and say, oh, just do whatever you want. It just doesn't work that way. We need to enforce laws.
Tarun, coming to you, education. Can the virtual world democratize education? Yes, we know, as you said, almost 2/3 of the world's population still doesn't have access to any kind of bandwidth through which they can learn. When the lockdown happened and schools went online, we at the Salam Bala Trust, each of our centers have 50 to 150 kids. We found it absolutely impossible to be able to run classes across that. So, there's that issue. But more importantly, meritocracy, as Michael Sandel's recent book has shown, which in itself is a problem because it shows that those who've succeeded are fantastic, everybody else is rubbish. Can this become a possible way? Is this virtual world a possible way of democratizing the Harvards of the world and making knowledge and information, as had started by Google Auntie in the year dot, make that far more accessible and therefore change the way that we learn? It has changed. And yet you have the paradox, Tarun, on the very program that you advised the Indian government on, of trying to create 100 best universities in the world. You have the government here saying, oh, but no university can access foreign speakers or professors or whatever. So you have both these really strange paradoxes, the need for control, yet the possibility of democratization of this space.
Sanjoy, it's a great question, something as an academic I grapple with every day. Apropos this strange circular that came out from the government saying that basically nobody can converse cross-border without getting permission. The good news is that I think the strangeness of that proclamation was recognized and it was pulled down. And I think it was withdrawn partly because it was a groundswell, particularly from the science community, but also from the humanities, to say, what the heck? How can you have a university or a conversation, intellectual conversation, if every single phrase needs to be validated with some babu in Delhi? That's not going to work. And luckily they've withdrawn that, so that's good. But I want to address a big issue, and not the only answer to your question, but the big issue I think is sort of the almost the vested interest, if you will, of the establishment, of which I'm a part, fortunately, unfortunately, as luck would have it. I think the incentives are not in place for the elite universities to really experiment dramatically with democratizing education, as you put it. That's the bad news. I know that as a would-be entrepreneur in digital education, trying to start nonprofits and companies, particularly for those 6 out of the 8 billion people that don't get access to education, it's been exciting, but it's been very tough to coax the rest of the establishment along. We're making progress, but very, very slowly. I suppose the other good news is that there's such a proliferation of interesting experiments. Time will tell whether they're as effective or what the boundary conditions are of how effective they'll be. But whether it's the the Khan Academies of the world, the Coursera's and the edX's and the Harvard X's of the world, or different experiments underway in India and Indonesia and Brazil, a whole bunch of these doing online education in various formats, or even things like Minerva University, which is trying to be, in effect, using online education to be more Ivy League than the Ivy League. But in a very interesting way, right? To say that by freeing ourselves from the constraints of physical campuses, in other words, embrace the virtualness for what it is, and build a sort of a virtual digital skin of elite education on top of pre-existing physical structures in 10 cities around the world. I think it's whatever you think of that idea, I think the fact that there's an efflorescence of experiments is something that I think we should celebrate and encourage. And some of these will die out and some will work, and that's awesome.
Marcus, fluorescence of experiments. Finally, you said we're all numbers. Is this the one point where the arts and sciences can come together? Because finally, it's all about numbers. You're coding an art piece, you're coding human intelligence, etc. And we go back to the world maybe 2 centuries ago, when knowledge and philosophy actually meant both the arts and the sciences. And the coming together of both those fields really created the next generation of ideas, ideation, and innovation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to a moment when somehow the barriers come down between the subjects, and people don't at school or university say they're studying English, mathematics, music, that actually we realize that these are all essentially the same thing. Yeah, I think it's one of the joys of the Jaipur Literary Festival is that you bring people from so many different disciplines together to share ideas, and this really is the way forward. I was asked actually by Wired magazine a few years ago to send back a postcard from the future about what I hoped the future would be like, and my wish was for an education system that didn't have these boundaries there. And I think we're in a very I think we're in a moment of phase change, and that's very exciting and very frightening. And there's been a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, and my recent work has been looking at the impact of artificial intelligence, an area which seems to be in science, and its impact on creativity, and the arts and the visual world and the music. And I think we tend to cast this as a debate too much about a sort of competition between the virtual and the real. I think this has been brought up a few times by speakers, and actually, in some ways, my background is HAL from 2001, and that seemed to be about, Hollywood is very responsible for this kind of conflict between the two. And my feeling is that we need to change that debate and really talk about this as a collaboration. It was already mentioned about these things being fantastic tools to help us as humans do new things. And we have to remember that the AI that's being developed, the machine learning, it isn't some other species. It is growing out of our data. It is learning about things that we can't see because of the challenge of scale of embodiment, and that so the recommendations, the directions it's taking us on are actually got its source in the human, and we tend to sort of talk about this as if it's some other species telling us what to do. No, it's a reflection actually of our world back to us in a new mirror, and we need to learn how to collaborate with that tool and I think you raised it right at the beginning about talking about empathy. What we need is an empathetic virtual world, an empathetic AI, so that we can go forward in a positive way.
Payal, collaboration and empathy, both words Marcus has used. When the lockdown happened in India, 23rd of March last year, on the 4th of April, we were up and running with JLF's Brave New World. Why? Because we just felt and believed that it was important to allow for a free flow of knowledge and information, and don't stop them in the way that it was being stopped. At the same time, when you look at the vaccine, the development of the vaccine today is the most incredible result of collaborations across universities, big pharma, scientists who have willingly helped each other. And it would not have been possible in what we know as the real world, because they've continued to have played with their own narrow confines. It opened it up. To some extent, it was the initial amount of empathy. How do we do this? How do we help the world? And of course, this whole thing of being able to collaborate. But it only happened because it was in the virtual space.
Absolutely. I mean, these are two very key terms, right? Compassion and empathy, like empathetic AI, as people have spoken about, and compassionate societies. That's the direction we want to head to. But, the problem is that while we are very much in agreement, we continue to design without including what I call the marginalized majority, which is the billions of people who are not at the center. We don't humanize a lot of the low income, marginalized entire groups of people, which are the norm. So we are the exceptions to the rule, right? And we do not actually put them at the center of design, center of even our imagination. It is very hard for us to feel empathetic towards an abstract society, an abstract group where we have very little insight on their conditions and their realities. So for us to even go there, let's just put them at the center. And already some really interesting developments are happening, like Avaz, for example, closer to home in India, where literally the design of the model of podcast is putting the next billion user market at the center of design, saying that, okay, if a number of institutions are going online and there's a lot of low literacy levels, let's make oral cultures the norm through which we can build our compassion and build our understandings of each other, because we really first need to get to know the other majority out there, which we don't seem to be still very engaged with. So we continue to design for basically the exceptions and not the rule, right?
We're building for the exceptions, not the rule. I've got a million questions coming up and we've mostly run out of time. So short answers as I keep posing them. Renata, Amia asks, do you think that social media has helped amplify the voices of people of color and queer people? So don't you think this is more real than the oppression faced in the real world? Short answers, please, because we really have to. Sorry.
Okay, before I say that, I just have to, I've been thinking so much about what many of the panelists said. And I think what we're missing from this panel is a Vedanta, India has the last word, Vedanta philosophy. What is real? Maybe it's all Maya. So I think that we have to remember that. With respect to...
I think it's what Marcus said, Renata, that we are finally all matter. We're all matter,
exactly.
In the blink of time, where do we stand? Is it just a knot? But anyway, back to you. Go ahead.
Except the Indian sages would say we're all consciousness, right? As opposed to we're all matter. Yeah. I think, obviously there are things that are more advantageous on the using, online, so to speak, and other things that are less advantageous. I think that basically we're in a situation right now where, the digital reality will accelerate progress towards the SDGs in many, many different ways. At the same time, it will create great inequalities. And at the same time, I'm very concerned about some of the effects that it's having on society, on individuals and society that I outlined earlier. So I really think we need a mass awareness raising campaign. We need, mass social inoculation from some of the, I would say, negative impacts it's having on our perception of ourselves and our perceptions of each other, just starting with distraction and brain fog. And we need a regulatory framework, because right now all of this is happening kind of willy-nilly. There is some regulation or self-regulation by some of the companies, and that's good. I think that's gradually increasing. It has to increase manifold. There needs to be some form of public regulation, because we can't leave it all in the hands of companies. And I'd like to just conclude with a wonderful little quotation, which is a little bit unsettling, but E.O. Wilson, who was a famous American biologist, he said, the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think that's where we're sitting right now in the confluence of these contradictory aspects of our existence.
Contradictory aspects of our existence. Melissa asks of you, Pragya, when the physical world under COVID is manifesting selfishness and each person for themselves, how can the virtual world shame individuals into a community-based moral and civic duty? And to that, I will add that in this virtual world that you talked about, everything is I want, for me, about me, I wish to acquire, and so on and so forth. Can that change? Does this allow for community? Can we look beyond ourselves at this point of time? Is that what this whole world is about? Or is it going to just, again, ingrain in us that those of us who can afford to buy, we buy, and the rest falls by the wayside? And you don't even have a sense of reality of that, what that wayside is any longer because of this new virtual world. Pragya. Short answer.
Thanks. I think
a big question, short answers.
Very big question, but a very good question. Thanks for asking. I think I'll just say that I have reason to believe that the virtual has provided a means of executing the physical vision. Let me give you an example. In the corporate world, we have spoken of agile working, empowering our employees, building dream teams who watch out for each other instead of pulling each other down and stabbing them at their backs. In this last 1 year, we've seen all of that come to life virtually. I mean, I don't have to explain agile working. That's self-explanatory. Empowerment, corporates have had to let go and give a lot of empowerment. Teams have looked out for each other, and this is just the corporate world. I have also reason to believe there is a lot of goodness that has gone in. There is a lot of charity. So much has been given in the field of education. Laptops, mobile phones, virtual devices being gifted so that people can get access. Likewise, so since you asked for a short answer, I mean, there is data behind it, but people have come together in a way that they have not physically in the last decade or even earlier. I had said that, I started with that, and I close with it.
I totally agree, Pragya. I think in the initial flush, those first 3 months as you locked down and your reality, and you went from, oh, it's a holiday, I don't have to go to work, to, oh my God, this is a reality. People in that first 3 months were generous. I'm not sure whether that's true anymore. We're going back. Instead of empathy, we're seeing again a return to selfishness. And on that, let me ask Meredith. Jessica asks of you, would you agree that the excessive use of virtual world during the lockdown last year has caused major withdrawal among today's youth? At this rate, if it continues, do you think forgetting to put on a presentable appearance, failing to practice social etiquette, and lacking the skill to effectively communicate with people will become the new order of the day? A similar version of this reality was shown in Pixar's 2008 animated film, WALL-E, where, of course, film always is first to tell us the world in front of us, with this 2001 Space Odyssey, or in fact, George Orwell's 1984, which has come to pass. Meredith.
So I think that the erosion of personal hygiene and the erosion of manners is not limited to youth. I think that all of the adults I know have also had significant erosion in these areas over the course of the pandemic. I went to a store yesterday for the first time in months. And it was a big warehouse store, and I was walking toward this woman who was in a wheelchair and had her dog on her lap. And I was looking at the dog and I was thinking about my own dog. And then the woman said, "Oh, hello, how are you? Can I help you?" And I realized I had been staring at her, which was totally inappropriate. And it was because I haven't been around other people very much lately. And I was just staring at the dog and thinking about my dog. And it was very rude of me. So I caught myself and I realized, oh yeah, I've been inside for way too long and I have not been around people for way too long. So the good thing is that you can catch yourself And these are not unforgivable kinds of transgressions. And kids are going to recover their social graces once we are all around each other, once people are vaccinated. And it's very easy for humans to communicate with each other. So yes, like if people are feeling uncommunicative and if kids are feeling like, oh, I don't really know how to talk to people in person because I've been texting so much, that's okay. And the only thing you need to do to fix it is just talk to people in person, right? So it's a problem, but it's not unsolvable.
Meredith says all of this is temporary. In Buddhist philosophy, our reality is a notch in the continuum of time. Looking into the future, will we be able to go back and forth as we're only numbers? Will we store our memories in a way that it doesn't matter what physical state we're in, but we will always be alive in the philosophical way of being ever eternally present?
Well, I think the mention of Vedanta was really interesting because, the question of whether there is only just pure consciousness and what is consciousness. It's something I made a couple of programs for the BBC about and wrote about in my previous book, What We Cannot Know. It seems to be one of the big open problems of science. But one of the most interesting developments has been in a sleep laboratory in Madison by Giulio Tononi, who's been trying to understand the difference between us in deep stage 4 sleep and awake. And it does seem to be very much about the connectivity, the nature of that connectivity. Almost, he's produced a mathematical formula which will measure your level of consciousness. And this will be really interesting going forward because, when will this thing actually become conscious? When will it suddenly say, iPhone think, therefore iPhone am? And we'll have to recognize that it's got an internal world, got rights we've got to give it. So, and the question of if that is information that makes us our consciousness, is that something that can be brought alive inside a machine? I mean, I think these are just absolutely fascinating questions that we're going to have to wrestle with. And again, it goes back to my previous answer that this is a question that can only be answered by many subjects coming together with their different perspectives, and not one will have the answers.
Different perspectives. Payal, what do we make of space? Not space as in space outside, but our own space. I remember when the lockdown happened and we shut office, a colleague of ours said, Renata, my wife, said that, it's all very well shutting down office, but for us, that is our only refuge. To you, the question is two. One is family at threat by the virtual world? And two, what will become our sense of space in this virtual world? Is it that we only need this, a computer and a laptop, and that's it, and we can exist in our own reality within this, ordering in, or perhaps in the future just reaching out and pulling out a cup of noodles from here? Will the sense of space change for us in the virtual world?
It's funny. I mean, you talk about space, and I was thinking about the book that I wrote before the Next Billion Users, which is called The Leisure Commons, where I talk about, I compare the virtual world and many of its different dimensions, from its corporate spaces to its, entertainment spaces, to that of parks, like the actual physical parks of the 18th and 19th centuries. And I speak about, it's not a coincidence that the metaphors of parks like the commons, the digital commons and the creative commons, came from that of the urban commons, right? Or when we were trying to architect space, we use the language of home pages or chat rooms, because we have to grasp cognitively and also affectively that space is not something out there like the cloud, but actually it's and even the cloud itself is architecting that sort of effusiveness, right? So when you talk about the family, it's the same conversation people thought about, oh my God, the television is going to disrupt the family. You put that idiot box in front and nobody's going to talk to each other. And actually it created, bring a family together and put them on a table, and they're probably going to have much more tension. And it's almost like leisure is a way to diffuse that, because you have something else to talk about. But why didn't you do your homework? Or I can't believe you've been stuck in that room for like 11 hours. Why didn't you come down? And, all that. You can actually then talk about, Bridgerton, right? You can talk about some other like CSI show and hate it and love it and diffuse and in fact create new forms of bonding. So, we have to recognize that the virtual is just, firstly, multiple different sites. And each site, basically each context, brings out certain aspects of us as individuals, as families, as communities, and as nations as a whole. And it is constantly moving and evolving. And we are all collectively responsible in the way in which we shape these institutions, because what we're doing is we're not just architecting them, we're structuring them, but we're trying to be ahead of the game so we can make sure that the values we hold dear now, today, where we've arrived at in terms of compassion and empathy and all the stuff we've been talking about, is embedded at the forefront. So it doesn't really matter which site of engagement you play your lives with, alone as well as with others.
Renata, last question. We've run out of time. Payal talked about institutions. I'm asking you, is it going to be a safer place for the world wars to move online than on ground? And how do you see that unpacking in the future?
Short answer, no. I don't think it's going to be safer online. Not by any means. And I think that, again, perhaps this goes back to the previous speaker, that it all depends what we do with these instruments, right? It all depends how we program them. And it all depends also, I have to emphasize, on the business model behind them. Because right now, the business model behind some of these online tools is structured in a way to make money for companies. It's not structured to build an empathetic society. It's not structured to cultivate compassion between people. So both the business models behind the technology and the design of the tools that we create with it and its interfaces, all that depends on us. So we can make it a very, very safe world, or we can make it very unsafe. I just want to leave with one example, which is not exactly a happy example, but back in 2016, I think it was, Microsoft created a chatbot called Tay. And the whole idea was to see whether artificial intelligence in this little chat box could figure out how to engage in casual, playful conversation through Twitter. So they put it up on Twitter, and within hours, it started to spew out the most racist, hateful, misogynist kinds of language, because that's what it was learning. It was totally unbiased in the beginning. Its only objective was to learn. And after 24 hours, they created a fascist bigot and had to take it offline. So it all depends on what we put into this fabulously, how should I say, with fabulous potential. It all depends what we put into it.
But that is one of the problem. Hatred is one of the problem that we are seeing. That is a tsunami, and it's really swamping people across social media. I'm sorry we have to stop. I'm sorry, Sujata, Shubhadeep, Jessica, and all of you sent in these hundreds of questions. I'm sorry, I just had too many questions of my own to unpack in this, so we couldn't take those questions. But Renata, Tarun, Khanna, Pragya, Sharma, Meredith, Payal, Marcus, Sautoy, thank you all for being part of this closing session. To all our speakers, our viewers, our volunteers, thank you for making this such an experience. When we started out 10 days ago, when we started out some months ago, thinking, how would we get our heads around trying to make this virtual festival give a sense of space, of built heritage, of personality, of being able to engage with each other? We didn't think we would have been able to crack it. But because of all of the incredible input that we've received from all our partners, especially our back-end partners, we've been able to find some success. Of course, there's a long way to go. We do hope to be back on ground. We've announced our dates for 2022, which is the 28th of January to the 1st of February. But before that, we hope to be on ground with JLF in London, JLF in North America, our new JLF in the Maldives in early September, which is anyway a green bubble, JLF in Toronto, in Australia, Belfast, and of course, hopefully in Doha. So to all of you, a big thank you. Thank you for staying the course. Thank you for being logged on. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you for all your contributions. We'd be happy to receive more. We have been struggling like everybody else. On that happy note, Ankur, over to you.
Thank you, Payal, Sautoy, Tarun, Renata, Pragya Sharma, Meredith, Broussard, and of course Sanjoy for such a thought-provoking conversation. We would also again like to thank our celebration partner, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. As you all are aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. And lastly, on behalf of all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts and at the festival, I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our incredible speakers, publishers, partners, viewers, sponsors, team members, well-wishers, and all our supporters for making Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 protected by Dettol a success. We look forward to seeing you in Jaipur, in India in 2022. Yes, the dates for 2022 are 29th January to the 1st of February 2022. Stay safe and thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.